Assalamu alaikum students. Welcome to ENG456. This is the module that is going to be Prose-I for you. And I know you've studied a lot of subjects, but this one you probably have not done before. So before we go on with the module, let me introduce you to what exactly we will be doing in this. The module is subtitled Essays, Prose-I, Essays, ENG456. So whatever work you're going to be doing, you will be quoting the code number for this, and that is ENG456, and the subject, that is essays. Now, when we speak about essays, there's hardly anything that can be added to what you people already know about essays. You have a lot of essays that you write at school level, at college level, and when you get to the university level, you start thinking, what new can we learn in this module? Well, let me tell you that there's a lot that you will be learning in this module, inshallah. I'm going to be teaching you this module, and before we go on into what essays are and what essays we will be studying, let me give you a very brief introduction of myself. My name is Shahina Ayub Bhatti, and for the last 26-27 years, I have been teaching at the National University of Modern Languages. I'm currently Associate Professor, so whatever I have learned in these years, I'm going to try my best to pass that on to you. And when we talk about essays in English literature, there is a wealth of information that is available to you. Those of you, and I'm sure all of you enrolled in this program have access to the internet. So as soon as you, let's say, Google the word essays, you come up with a whole lot of stuff. Some of it I'm going to tell you about in this and the succeeding lectures, but you will get a lot more information if you supplement that with studies of your own. So what I'm going to be doing is introducing some of the essays, but I would like you to read as many essays as possible. The more you read, the better your comprehension and appreciation are going to be, and the better your own expression is going to be when you start doing your assignments and your project presentations. So no matter what you learn in class from me or from the material that I'm going to be giving out to you, is going to be nothing compared to what you will learn when you supplement that with your own reading. So please do not think that what I'm going to be doing with you in this class is sufficient. It is never sufficient. You will have your handbook. I'll give you useful links that you can access and where you can find more material. But at the end of the day, it's going to be your work that's going to be important. So dear students, without further ado, let us launch into ENG456, Prose-I, that is essays. Now, we're going to be breaking up this module into two portions. One is Introduction to Essays, which is going to be brief, and the other is going to be Essays and Essays. So let us go on with the Introduction to Essays. And the first thing that you come across is the definition. You know, we're all very fond of giving definitions and studying definitions, memorizing definitions. So you have a definition here also, and that is, essays are brief, non-fiction compositions that describe, clarify, argue, or analyze a subject. You see how much goes into an essay, and you think it's very easy when you get an essay to write in your exam paper at intermediate level or even at BA level. One of the renowned professors, Professor Cruz of University of California, Berkeley, has defined an essay as a fairly brief piece of nonfiction that tries to make a point in an interesting way. Now, I want you to remember this definition, particularly because the essays that we're going to be dealing with are all going to be very interesting. Some you might find not interesting, but I want you to keep in mind the fact that what may not be interesting for you may be of interest to another person. So hopefully you'll enjoy learning as much as I'm going to be enjoying teaching you this module. So an essay is not just a bunch of words or even a bunch of paragraphs. An essay all fits together. So there has to be cohesion, and you're going to be using this word a lot, not just when you are doing this module, but in other modules also, particularly when you're doing writing, when you're doing your assignments. Your assignment is basically an essay. So when you do your assignments, keep that in mind. And everything points in one direction. All the information that you find in an essay points to one direction. And as it says here, it leads to one conclusion. So there's one main point in the essay, and everything else leads up to that. The introduction, the body, the conclusion, all make one single point. Now, you ask me, what else do we need to know about an essay? And let me tell you that the modes of discourse, exposition, description, narration, argumentation, and the acronym is EDNA, E-D-N-A. Exposition, description, narration, argumentation. These four you need to know. These are also types of essays. They're not only modes of discourse, they're also types of essay. So as we go on with this module and we have lectures on different essays and sample essays, I'll be telling you what type of essay it is, and I would also want you to try to see what type of essay this is and what category it falls into. And when we do EDNA, remember, E-D-N-A, the first type that we take up is the expository essay. And let me tell you that an expository essay investigates ideas, evaluates evidence, expounds on the idea, and sets forth an argument concerning that idea in a clear and concise manner. So clarity of expression is a must for an expository essay. And it must be concise. It must not be a rambling essay. And we're going to be doing a few rambling essays also, just to give you a taste of the different types. So an expository essay makes a point in a very clear and concise manner. And he says this can be accomplished through comparison and contrast, definition, example, and the analysis of cause and effect. So this one category is further subdivided, and you're going to see how the different sample essays that I give you fall into these different categories. All right? So the first thing that you need to remember is EDNA, expository, descriptive, narrative, argumentative. And then when we take the expository essay, you need to remember that it has to be clear and concise, and this can be accomplished through different modes. And these modes are comparison and contrast, definition, example, and analysis of cause and effect. Then that brings us to the D in the EDNA. And the D stands for descriptive. So the descriptive essays are a genre of essay that describes something, obviously. It can be an object, a person, a place, an experience, an emotion, a situation, and a host of other things. So it deals with a description of whatever it is, emotion, experience, expression, place, object, person, etc. This genre encourages written accounts of a particular experience and allows for a great deal of artistic freedom. For example, you're writing about a house. It gives you a lot of freedom because you can spend one whole paragraph describing just one wall in a room of the house. It depends on how much time and effort you want to put in. So a descriptive essay allows you a lot of freedom, and that freedom is given to the essayist because the idea is to paint an image that is so clear that you don't have to rely on your imagination. You see the object or the place as it is being described. And that brings us to the third type of essay, and that is the narrative essay. A narrative essay tells a story and is often anecdotal. So maybe an incident, an experience, it's experiential and personal. So a narrative essay always gives you freedom to improvise. Improvise in the sense that you add details of your own because you're the narrator, so it gives your point of view. If I'm the narrator, it's going to give my point of view. So my narrative may be different from your narrative because you might be focusing on something different. For example, we have what are the common topics that are given for essays at school and college level? Let's say a football match. You know, that's the one that you get a lot of these darsis and guidebooks writing about. So you have a football match, I go to a football match, you go to a football match. You see how the players are playing. What I see is how the crowd is behaving. So what I am going to be narrating is incidents from the different spectators who are watching the match and how they are behaving, what they are doing. I would not be concerned so much about whether the referee made a sound decision or team members misbehaved or the umpire gave an unfair decision, etc., etc. So each one of us can improvise and give the narrative in a way that shows our personal bias, our personal liking. So it's creative and it's interesting. And that brings us to the last type of essay, and that is the argumentative essay. You like arguments, I like arguments. We indulge in a discussion. An argumentative essay is a genre of writing that requires investigating a topic, collecting, generating and evaluating evidence, and then establishing a position on the topic, again in a concise manner. So conciseness is an essential part of essays. So now you know what the 4 different types are. Remember, EDNA, E, expository, D, descriptive, N, narrative, and A, argumentative. All right? Now, if you want, you can go over these slides again and see the different types that I have described to you. Okay? Now, we need to move on, and when we move on, the first thing that I would like you to keep in mind is that we are going to be doing 4 essayists. Okay? This module is divided into essays written by Francis Bacon, Joseph Addison, Richard Steele, and Charles Lamb. Now, when you study the history of the essay, you find out that it goes back a long way. It goes back to way back when English first came to be used in England. You know that for a very long time, England was dominated by the languages Latin and Greek, and these were considered to be classical languages. The literature of these languages also dominated the people who could read and write, which, when you're talking about the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, was a handful of people. In the medieval ages, and I'm sure you have studied your history of English language and history of English literature and the history of England, and you know by now that these 3 histories are very closely interlinked. You cannot study English literature unless you know the history of the language and the history of Great Britain. So you know that in the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, the language that was used in writing in England was Latin, and less than that was Greek. Latin was the language of learning, and so everything that was written and everything that was read was in the Latin language. The church used Latin for all texts, and for a very long time you didn't have the Bible in the English language. So the Bible that is available now goes back to the time of King James I, and that is the 17th and the very end of the 17th century. So it's not until the 17th century that you have a Bible written in the English language, and which can be taken as the authorized version, which is also known as the King James Bible. Now, when we talk about essay writing, we're going back to the 16th century. Before that, you have writing in English, but it is very rudimentary. And you have poetry being written in the English language. You have poetry written in the English language going way back to Chaucer. But you see that the English that Chaucer writes is not the English that you're writing today. It's not easy to read. So when we talk about essay writing and essays in English, the person that we start off with is Francis Bacon. All right? We'll give you a bit more about Francis Bacon, but let me show you a picture of Francis Bacon, and that's going to be more helpful in describing to you what exactly we're going to study about Francis Bacon. Now that you've seen a picture, you see the way he's dressed. Francis Bacon was basically a courtier in the court of Queen Elizabeth I of England, and later King James I. The essays that we're going to be doing, and which have been written by Francis Bacon, are of truth, of marriage and single life, of studies, of discourse, of friendship, of simulation and dissimulation, and of great place. So these 7 essays we will be dealing with in this module. Now, it might appear to you to be a very small number, but when we are doing Francis Bacon's essays, you will realize that Bacon uses a single sentence, and there's a wealth of meaning in each sentence that he uses. He was a very well-read person. He was not only a courtier and a statesman, he was a politician. He had studied law. He was a statesman. He was a courtier. He had very important positions in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. And when I say that you need to have a background of the history of England when you're studying something like essay writing in England, it will make more sense if I give you a little explanation on that. And that is that the 16th century, which is where we're going to start our module of essays, was a very important time in the history of not just England, but of Europe. This is the period that is known as the Renaissance. You've all heard of the Renaissance age, and I know you know a lot about the Renaissance, but let me just reinforce a few of the points. This is the time that is known as the revival of learning, and you need to remember that it is not revival of learning only in the fields of arts and literature, but it is the sciences also. So you had a lot of experimentation going on. You had people like Galileo Galilei, who said that the earth is not the center of the universe, and that we are a part of the solar system in which not the earth but the sun is the focus, and the earth revolves around the sun. Now these were ideas that were revolutionary, and if you remember, Galileo was forced to recant, and when he refused to take back his opinions, the church came down hard on Galileo. The church till this point in time had a very strong influence on the lives of individuals. So when a scientist like Galileo Galilei, who remember was an astronomer, when he came up with this idea and he said that I have looked at the heavens through my telescope, and there are many more stars there, and the earth is a very small particle in the universe, the priests became very angry with him, and they said that Galileo was a heretic and needed to be punished because he was spreading wrong ideas. The earth and therefore man was the center of the universe, and nobody could go around spreading ideas that went against this belief. So the reason why I'm telling you all this is, when you have somebody like Francis Bacon coming in and writing not just essays but writing philosophical treatises, you have a person who not only has knowledge of whatever is happening around him, but he is well read. That means he has read the classics, he has read whatever tracts have been published in science, and he was one of those very few people who were not only men of letters, but he was also a man of science. And he conducted a lot of experiments which proved theories or which disproved existing theories. So Bacon is the ultimate Renaissance man. If you go back to his picture, you'll see that he's dressed up like a courtier. So when you look at this image of Francis Bacon, what you see is a man who can afford to spend money on his clothes. You see he's wearing this fine velvet and silk and lace. And these were materials that were not just restricted to women, but the men of Elizabeth's time also wore these materials. And the reason why I'm focusing on the materials is that these materials were not being produced in England. This is the time when Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh had gone out into the open sea and had taken over the Spanish Armada, which was carrying a lot of gold, a lot of wealth. And with the capture of the Spanish fleet, England overnight became rich. Queen Elizabeth became one of the richest people in the world because the Spanish Armada was laden with gold and silver and all kinds of wealth. So when they captured that, all that wealth was brought into England, and overnight the economy of England boomed. So with this economic stability came a different outlook. And people like Francis Bacon, who were courtiers of Queen Elizabeth, they benefited. So whatever material benefits they got is reflected in his writings. When he writes about truth and he writes about discourse and studies and married life and single life, you see that he is writing on everyday subjects, and yet these are subjects that he treats very differently. It's not the kind of, let's say, writing style where he needs pages and pages. Bacon is one of those writers who's very concise. And if you go back to the definitions of essay that I gave you a few slides back, one of the points that was emphasized again and again was that an essay is concise. So as far as Bacon is concerned, he gives you the topic of the essay as the title. So if he writes about truth, the title of the essay is Of Truth. If he writes about marriage and single life, then that is the essay title. So you don't have to get confused as to what exactly he's going to be writing about. It's very clear. Whatever the essay topic is, that's what you're going to find within the essay. And most of these essays are short. Again, I take you back to the original definition. It must be pithy and precise, must be very, very concise, must be very focused. So one point is being discussed, and whether there are 3 paragraphs or 6 paragraphs, the central idea that is being explored is one only, and that is given as the essay title. Now, 17th century, we have Francis Bacon. We move on into the 18th century, and we have something that is called the Spectator. You might be wondering what the Spectator stands for. So I'm going to give you a bit of background on the Spectator. The Spectator was a newspaper. It was a daily newspaper, just as you have so many in your own country. You have the Daily News, you have the Daily Jung, you have Khabrein, you have what else? You have Nawai Waqt, you have Dawn, you have The Nation, and you have so many newspapers being printed around the world. So the Spectator was a newspaper that was published. It began in the beginning of the 18th century, 1711, 1st March 1711 was the date when the first issue of the Spectator was published, and it was a collaborative project. The 2 people who worked on it were Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. I'm showing you these photos so that you can associate these two people when we talk about The Spectator. So The Spectator was a newspaper that was published every day starting March the 1st, 1711, and the last issue was published on December 6th, 1712. So for about a year and a half, there was this newspaper that was published, and what they gave in the newspaper were essays written by these two writers that I've already mentioned and whose pictures I have shown to you, and let me show them again, Richard Steele and Joseph Addison. So these two, they collaborated and they started publishing the newspaper that was known as The Spectator. And when we are doing essays from The Spectator, I'll give you more detail on what was discussed and the type of essays that were written at that time. Now, because this was a joint project, a project that was carried out by two people, I'm going to give you a little background of both Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. But before we go on with that, critics have stated that The Spectator enjoyed a lot of popularity, and it was issued every day, and it managed to exercise a lot of influence on the minds of the reading public of that time. Now, when we say of that time, I need to give you a little background of the times also. Between the time when Francis Bacon was writing and the time when Joseph Addison and Richard Steele were writing in The Spectator, a lot had happened in England. After James I ascended the throne, and you know that he followed Elizabeth I, he was succeeded by his son Charles I. Now, Charles I was a rather weak ruler, and his claim on the throne was challenged by Parliament, because it was at this time that Parliament became a very important pillar of the state. During the time of King James I and Queen Elizabeth I, the monarch had been very, very powerful, and Parliament ruled according to the instructions of the monarch. But with Charles I coming in, and since he was himself weak, Parliament became very strong, to the extent that it assumed it assumed the responsibility for carrying out the daily affairs. Charles I was surrounded by the kind of courtiers who were not good statesmen, and who, I guess, misguided him. And it so happened that Charles I was executed, and his son was not allowed to assume the throne. Instead, Parliament, headed by Oliver Cromwell, took over the affairs of the state. And for a long time, Parliament ruled in England, and there was no monarch. With the illness and death of Oliver Cromwell, the power of the Parliament was reduced, and ultimately the monarchy was restored, with the difference that Parliament was still a very important pillar of the state, and the king or queen had to be had to work in collaboration with the Parliament. No longer could the king or the queen dictate to the Parliament. So you see how the setup became different. Now, when monarchy was restored, there was a time of celebration. It was a time when Englishmen and Englishwomen could rejoice and say, all right, no longer do we have the Roundheads, as the parliamentarians were called, governing them, and they could celebrate, and they could say that finally, you know, we have a certain amount of freedom, and Parliament is not dictating everything that we can or cannot do. So with the restoration of the monarchy, there was that spirit of celebration, and there was a certain confidence that that emerged. And another important change that came about at this time was that the right to the throne of England was no longer by virtue of birth only. You had to establish your claim. So when Prince William of Orange was laid a claim to the throne of England, it was not only because he was a direct descendant, but also because his wife, Queen Mary II, had an equal claim to the throne. So this is about the only time in the history of England that you have the king and the queen both being crowned and both having equal claim to the throne. And that is why this period, which is sort of linked to the restoration of monarchy, is known for its spirit of celebration, and that is why this era is known as the William and Mary era. It's not just the William era; it's the William and Mary era. And this, of course, was followed by the reign of Mary's sister, Queen Anne, and she also had a direct claim to the throne. So this entire period that I'm talking about is known as the Restoration era. Strictly speaking, it is not the Restoration era, but because the monarchy was being sort of re-established, so this entire time is lumped together when you're studying the history of English literature. Joseph Addison and Richard Steele were writing in the backdrop of all that was happening in England at that time. So the Spectator, the topics that it deals with, and the kind of writing that you see in the essays from the Spectator are going to be very different when you read them in comparison with essays written by Francis Bacon. So now that you've seen a picture of Addison and Steele, I want you to look at them again, because there's one thing that you will notice, and that is common in both photos, and that is they are dressed in a similar fashion. When you see the picture of Francis Bacon, and I can take you back a few slides, and you see you can see Francis Bacon, the way he's dressed, and when you look at the images of Addison and Steele, you see that there is one very basic difference. They're still wearing velvets and silks, but they have these long curly wigs. Now this is something that is very, very specific to this period. And during this period, the interesting thing is that men did not wear their own hair, or men in the court, men of a certain standing, did not wear their own hair. I'm not saying they shaved it off, but they wore these long curly wigs because that was the fashion of the time. So just as now you have people, let's say, wearing dreadlocks, where you have these long braids, what you would call very, very traditional braids. Similarly, the fashion in those times, and I'm talking about the 18th century, the fashion in those times was for men of a certain standing, men of high society, to wear wigs. Now there might be blonde wigs, there might be black wigs, there might be brown wigs. These were the three colors that were being worn. And no man of any standing would be seen without his wig. It was almost like going out with no clothes. So Joseph Addison was a man who was a statesman, courtier, essayist, poet and playwright. He had a very good education, and his education, like that of Francis Bacon, included a very heavy dose of Latin. Remember, even in the 18th century, Latin was very influential. So when boys were sent to school, Latin was one of the languages that they had to be conversant in. And just as Bacon's education was slightly medieval, the education that Addison received also had a very strong imprint of Latin. And when I repeat this, you will realize when we're doing the essays how strong an influence Latin had on these essays. So during his education, Addison excelled in the classics, particularly command of Latin verse. During the course of his career, he was asked to write a poem. His poems were very well known, and during the War of the Spanish Succession, when the Duke of Marlborough defeated the French at Blenheim, this was an occasion that was unprecedented. The French and the English had always been at daggers drawn throughout history, and the French had even looked down on the English as upstarts. So the Duke of Marlborough, when he defeated the French forces, this brought a wave of jubilation to England. And it was at this point in time that Joseph Addison was asked to write a poem to commemorate this victory. And he did such a wonderful job that from there he went on, and he was pretty successful as a statesman. Now, the reason why Addison and Steele are always sort of bracketed together is because The Spectator was a joint project. Addison had started it. They had worked earlier on writing in the English magazine that had the name of The Tatler. Because their friendship went back to school, it was at Charterhouse that Addison and Steele had met, and this friendship grew over the years. until they started writing together. And when Addison started The Spectator, he asked Steele to come in, and it was something that was very natural, because Steele, who had been very excited at the thought of King William's campaign against the French, joined the army, but his love affair with the army did not last long, because although he got a commission in the army, he soon found out that you needed two things in order to make your way in the army. One was a lot of money, the other was connections. You needed money because commissions in the army at that time were bought. Now, I know that's a very strange idea, but you need to keep in mind the fact that this is how things were being done at that time. Commissions in the army were bought. So if you had some money, you could buy a commission as a lieutenant. If you had more money, you could go as captain. And if you had a lot of money, I guess you could go directly as a colonel or even a brigadier general. So anyway, this was the setup of the English army. And when you have the opportunity to do a little extra reading, there's one book that I recommend, and that is The Charge of the Light Brigade. And some of you might have read the poem in school. If you have not, it is The Charge of the Light Brigade, and it tells the story of how commissions were bought in the English army and what that resulted in. So coming back to Richard Steele, Steele bought a commission in the army because he was motivated by King William's campaign against the French. This was the time of the War of the Spanish Succession, and the English were combating the French and trying to sort of make their own place in Europe. And in fact, Steele had been so excited at the prospect of King William's campaigns against the French that he left his studies incomplete. He didn't complete his degree, and he joined the army. So that the money that he had, he bought a commission in the army, he was promoted to the rank of captain. But that was where things came to an end, because he realized that if he wanted to go further in the army, he needed money and he needed connections, and he had neither. So, in disgust, he left the army and came back into active life. When you read through the essays as we're going on with the module, one of the things that you're going to realize is that a lot of stress is paid to things which would not be of interest to, let's say, the common man, perhaps not of interest to you or to me, but it would be interesting to a different class of people. The reason is Addison and Steele were both statesmen. They were not moving with the kind of people who were poor. They were not even middle class. They were definitely moving in the higher circles of society, the upper echelons of society. And so their interests are different. One of the reasons why I showed you the photographs of both Addison and Steele again and again, and I emphasized on the wigs that they were wearing and the clothes that they were wearing, was to make you realize that these are not poor people. These are people who spend a lot of time and money and effort on their clothes and therefore on their appearance. The fact that they're wearing wigs is important because appearance was all important. It wasn't important what you were like actually, but how you appeared was all important. This is, remember, the 18th century. Appearances are all important. And so if you are going out in society, you have to be dressed the way society dictates. So if society dictates that you have to wear a wig, you wear a wig. You don't wear your own hair, because that is not the done thing. So this was the time when men were spending a lot of time, money and effort on their dresses, on their manners, because appearance was all important. All right? So Steele had written a tract about a duel that he had fought with one of his friends, and in which he had wounded his friend, and that left a very strong impression on him, and he wrote this tract against dueling. A lot of the people at that time appreciated his writing, but there were many people who thought that there was a sort of discrepancy between what he was preaching and what he was practicing. And in spite of the fact that that there were 10 editions of this tract, there were quite a few people who brought up this argument that there was a lot of difference between his practice and his preaching. So this was the time when he had left the army, and he was asked to collaborate on this project, and he started writing in The Spectator. And mind you, The Spectator was published daily from March 1st, 1711 to December 6, 1712, and that was a total of 555 issues. That's a lot of issue when you keep in mind the fact that this was being done way back in the 18th century. So Addison and Steele worked in collaboration and wrote on many different topics in The Spectator. The last essayist that we will be dealing with in this module is Charles Lamb, and I know a lot of you people have heard about Charles Lamb. Maybe you've read something about him during your school or college times. Lamb is one of the most popular essayists. He was also writing in the 18th century, but writing after The Spectator. So what you see is that essay writing in general reached its peak in the 16th century and moved on from there into the 17th and 18th century. The 18th century is peak time for essay writing. Every genre has its peak periods, and then there are periods when the public sort of loses interest in essay writing and in reading and perusing essays. So the 18th century is the heyday of essay writing, and in the 19th century the novel took over, and since then novel has been the most popular genre in literature in contemporary times. So to come back to essay writing, Charles Lamb is a favorite with a lot of readers. In collaboration with his sister Mary Lamb, they published Tales from Shakespeare, so maybe during school you will have read this book that is titled Tales from Shakespeare, and which gives in prose form the themes of some of Shakespeare's most famous plays. So that is one of the works that Charles Lamb is famous for. And the other thing that he's famous for is essays written under the pen name of Ilya. And these essays of Ilya are written under the persona of Ilya, and Charles Lamb takes on this persona, and he writes from the point of view of another individual. But you can see that a lot of the time his essays are autobiographical. They have references to various people, various places that he lived in or that he visited, and ideas and thoughts that were very important to Charles Lamb himself. So the essays that we'll be doing in this module by Charles Lamb are Dream Children, a Reverie, Poor Relations, where he's talking about relatives who are very poor and who are always waiting for their rich relations to provide for them. The Praise of Chimney Sweepers, That You Must Love Me and Love My Dog, which comes under the title of Popular Fallacies, and you have other fallacies also that Lamb discusses in very brief and concise manner. Then you have his ideas on the old and the new schoolmaster. Then he writes about the two races of men. So, you know, he discusses different things, and in the two races of men, for example, he talks about borrowers and lenders. And then he has this very interesting essay that is titled A Chapter on Ears. So they're all going to be very interesting essays, and I hope that you will enjoy it, not just the text, but the way that we're going to go about this essay. Before I take leave, let me quickly go through what we have done today so that I can sort of recap for you, and you also have an idea of how we're going to go about this module. If you remember at the very beginning, I started off with telling you that this module, and particularly this lecture, is broken up into two halves. One is the introduction to essay, and the other is essays and essays. And in the introduction to essays, I told you that there were 4 different types of essays, just as there are 4 different modes of discourse, and that is exposition, description, narration, and argumentation. And so when we say that there are 4 categories of essays or 4 types of essays, these are the expository, the descriptive, the narrative, and the argumentative. And I also went on to describe and define for you each of these types. And I told you that the expository essay discusses something in detail, and it can be through comparison and contrast, it can be an analysis, it can be an in-depth description. And when we come to descriptive essays, it can be about an object, a place, an emotion. The narrative essay is more personal and subjective, and it can relate an incident, it can relate an experience, and there is the option of being creative in a narrative essay, because one person's narrative might be very different from another person's narrative. And the example that I gave you was that of a football match, and I told you that maybe you would like to concentrate on the game itself or on the players, but I might be more interested in the spectators and what they are doing and what their reaction to the entire game is. So in a narrative essay, you can afford to be creative. The argumentative type of essay is one where you show both sides of the argument and then you give a conclusion. So it has to be very logical, it has to be very rational. And from there we moved on, and I told you that we are going to be dealing with 4 different essays, and each one of them represents a particular type of essay. So when we do Bacon, we're going to be doing essays that are very concise, very pithy, very precise, and where Bacon exposes, and he is a master of the expository type of essay. He exposes one particular subject and he gives you detail, but even in this detail, He is very, very concise, and his arguments are very pithy. His style is precise. So where other writers would use pages, Bacon is only going to give you, let's say, one line. So that one line would be very frequently quoted. And most of Bacon's statements are taken as aphorisms, as words of wisdom, and he's one of the most frequently quoted English writers or English men of letters. And from there we went on to The Spectator, and I told you that The Spectator was a newspaper that was published in the 18th century, and it was a collaborative project where Joseph Addison and Richard Steele were working together to produce a newspaper every single day, and there were a total of 555 issues starting from the 1st of March 1711. The last issue was published on the 6th of December 1712. So a total of 555 essays were published on matters which were of interest to the aristocracy and what you would call the elite society of the 18th century. The last essayist that we discussed was Charles Lamb, and I told you that Lamb is one of the most favorite essayists. He had a very hard life. You know, there was a streak of insanity in his family, and his sister Mary particularly fell a victim to that. But Lamb sacrificed throughout his life because he did not want Mary to be institutionalized. He didn't want her put away. So he took on that responsibility of taking care of her. And because he had health issues also, and there was this strain of insanity in their family, he had a rather unhappy life. And one of the high points of his life was his friendship with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, to the extent that Lamb did not last long after Coleridge, and it was exactly 6 months after Coleridge's death that Lamb also passed away. But during the time that he was here, he wrote a lot. He wrote profusely, and under the pen name of Elia, Lamb gave us a lot of essays, and his essays, you find, are more related to everyday issues. And whether he's writing about dream children, or he's writing about marriage and single life, or he's writing about poor relations, you find out that these are essays that are related to current issues. They're not just issues that were in his lifetime. It was not just restricted to the 18th century. These are issues that we still deal with even in the 21st century. So a little more imagination comes in Lamb's writing, but you find out that he writes in a very light tone. He uses irony, there's humor, there's pathos, but above everything is his treatment of a subject. And when we dealing with Lamb in detail, you will have the opportunity to experience for yourself the way Lamb writes and the subjects on which he writes. And I'm sure you're going to understand, and by the end of this module you'll be able to appreciate the different forms of writing that we'll be dealing with in this module. Thank you for being very patient, and Allah Hafiz.